In our last accounting, we observed as Octavian, having unified Rome and achieved the pinnacle of success, performed a most curious act of political theater. He resigned from the two most august and coveted titles in the Republic, dictator and consul. In their stead, he adopted the new honorific of Augustus and an assortment of proconsular commands over the frontier provinces. The wealthiest territories, the true prizes of the empire, he left for others, an act on its face of almost baffling humility. Then, this seemingly humble figure did something rather interesting. On the authority of his status as a triumphant military commander, an imperator, he established his own Praetorian Guard, a personal security detail, stationed for the express purpose of protecting him within the sacred walls of Rome itself. Was this legal? One hesitates to say. Precedent was silent. For no commander had ever garrisoned a private army within the city. But was it illegal? The law, after all, stipulated that a commander was entitled to a protective guard. The wrinkle, of course, was that this particular commander now held authority over a portfolio of provinces, while simultaneously bearing the title of Augustus. And he showed no inclination whatsoever of leaving the capital. The legality of the matter became a rather murky question. To this question, Octavian offered only a faint, dismissive smile and no answer. He then resumed his work of collecting new titles. In the year 23 BC, the Senate bestowed upon him the title of Princeps Civitatis, First Citizen, a title of such profound modesty one might almost be convinced. I am, it seemed to say, merely one of you, a simple citizen of Rome, albeit one whose identity card happens to be numbered 1. Of course, this term would later be rendered into other tongues as fouvre, a translation of what one might call chilling accuracy. A decade passed. Then, in 13 BC, after a very long wait, the man named Lepidus finally expired. Why, you might ask, did Octavian so eagerly anticipate the death of Lepidus? Because he coveted the man's hat, or rather, the office that went with it, the title of Pontifex Maximus, High Priest. Could a man of Octavian's power not simply have seized the position? Absolutely not. Roman law was unyielding on this point. The office of High Priest was for life. Until the incumbent was dead, you had to wait. As for other methods, a quiet assassination, that was not Octavian's way. The master thespian had been on stage for far too long to risk his accumulated prestige, his carefully curated public image, on such a vulgar gambit. But why did he desire this particular title so? That is a question we shall answer momentarily. By this point, the collection was impressive. Heir of Caesar, Imperator, Augustus, First Citizen, and now High Priest, the Senate and people of Rome had, for the most part, willingly bestowed these honors upon him, because at the time, this peculiar assortment of titles seemed largely ornamental, harmless. We have said it many times, the true levers of power in the traditional Roman state were tribune, consul, censor, and magistrate. Octavian, however, would soon give the Roman people a masterclass in what power truly was. Having secured the office of High Priest, he did not waste a moment. He immediately leveraged the religious authority of the position to launch a most audacious campaign. A campaign of divine branding. He instructed his legions to begin a new religious practice. Before battle, they were to offer sacrifices not to Jupiter, not to Mars, but to the spirit of Augustus, praying for victory. Under his forceful promotion, this ritual rapidly evolved from a military mandate into a daily rite, which then bled out from the barracks and into the civilian populace. You may recall Caesar's Julian calendar, wherein the month of July bears his name. Octavian, naturally, did precisely the same. Using his authority as High Priest, he declared that the 8th month would henceforth be known as August. Furthermore, he elevated it to the status of a major month, granting it 31 days, equal to Caesar's July. But this created an imbalance, an untidy, stray day in the calendar. It had to be taken from somewhere. From which month, you ask, should it be carved? In the original Julian scheme, odd months were long, and even months were short. To make the numbers align with the solar year, February had already been trimmed to a mere 29 days by Roman tradition. It was an unlucky month anyway, a time for settling accounts with the condemned. Now, Octavian had willed an extra day into existence for August. That day, of course, was clawed back from the most vulnerable, and so the unfortunate month of February was once again asked to make a sacrifice and was diminished to 28 days. This is the very calendar which, having been adopted by the popes, is still in use to this day. And the English word for the 8th month, August, is a direct echo of this ancient power play. These two acts, seemingly minor, had the profound effect of minting a new divinity for the Roman people, the divine Augustus, through a series of such dazzling maneuvers. Octavian achieved the unthinkable. Without altering a single Roman institution, without treading on the toes of a single vested interest, he had constructed an entirely new superstructure of power. He had built it just outside the traditional political framework of Senate, Consul, and Tribune, a new leadership team composed of titles like Caesar, Augustus, first citizen, and Imperator, which now hovered supreme over the old order. At this juncture, his full official designation had become first citizen. Triumphant general, Caesar, son of a god, Augustus, the name his own father had given him, Octavian, was nowhere to be found. And what was the use of these titles? Let us be clear. Before Octavian, they were little more than baubles. You could have offered them to the most celebrated figures of Roman history, and they might well have looked upon them with disdain. But after Octavian, they became sacred. First citizen became the accepted term for the Roman emperor. Imperator, the triumphant general, became the direct root of the English word emperor. And Caesar would evolve into the word for emperor in both German and Russian. Why did these words suddenly acquire such weight? Because of power. By this point, Octavian, armed with this arsenal of titles, was a king in all but name. He held absolute sway over the Senate. He commanded the devoted loyalty of the people. The army was his instrument. The levers of administration were entirely in his hands. If he wished to appoint a consul, that man would be scrambling to his new post by the following morning. When a man of such authority, of such presence, uses a set of titles at the peak of his power, those titles naturally become the prize for all who follow. Power, you see, is the ultimate consecration. Once a word is drenched in it, that word becomes the indispensable symbol of rule for generations to come. You may still wonder, why not simply declare himself king? Why this elaborate, convoluted performance? The answer is brutally simple. The Romans had once lived under kings. The memory was not a fond one. To call oneself king was to declare war on the very soul of Rome. A performer of Octavian's caliber would never stumble into such an obvious public relations minefield. And so, to summarize, this man, using unparalleled political skill and a masterful performance, executed a grand transfer of power without ever touching the foundations of the Republic. He gathered all authority unto himself. He became the de facto emperor of Rome, yet a clarification is essential here, though historians mark the year 27 BC. When Octavian received the title of Augustus as the beginning of the Roman Empire, the name of Rome itself remained unchanged. It was, and would be for centuries, SBQR, the Senate and people of Rome. The strategy is easy enough to understand. Octavian's great innovation was to achieve the goals of an autocracy under the banner of a republic. His successors would follow the same playbook. They would accumulate a dizzying array of titles, monopolize all real power, but never, ever dismantle the republican stage set. When they wished to act, they did so through the traditional offices of consul, censor, and the rest. This little piece of stagecraft, of course, did not fool the gimlet eye of the historian. And so, in their chronicles, the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire. It is merely that the Roman people of the time did not know it. They believed they were still living in the Republic. It would not be until the reign of Diocletian, more than 300 years later, that Augustus and Caesar were formally established as titles of imperial rank with explicitly defined powers. And the title of imperator, the one we call triumphant general, would have to wait even longer. Not until the Eastern Roman Empire, the glittering entity we now call Byzantium, would it be formally defined as the supreme authority. But as they say, good things come to those who wait, and precisely because imperator was the last to arrive at the party, it was the one that ultimately outlasted all the others. In the English language, it alone became synonymous with the word emperor because of this evolution of titles. Historians typically refer to the Roman imperial system from Octavian to Diocletian as the Principate. Only after Diocletian's reforms does it become the Dominate, a more overt monarchy, but in truth, this is largely a change in nomenclature. The practical difference was not so great, but let us return to our narrative. From 27 BC onward, Octavian, using his magnificent collection of miscellaneous titles, which we shall, for simplicity's sake, call emperor, ruled Rome for 40 years. Throughout history, when a man acquires great power, he often turns his gaze outward toward conquest. Consider Rome's own first triumvirate, or Mark Antony. Which of them did not dream of conquering Parthia, of erecting a grand monument to his own glory? Perhaps Octavian harbored such desires, but this was a man who did not relish brute force. He much preferred to achieve his aims through negotiation, diplomacy, and design. In Asia, for example, after securing Armenia and the Caucasus, he engaged in a series of delicate maneuvers that ushered in a long period of peaceful coexistence with the Parthian Empire. He reaped the benefits without the ruinous cost in blood and treasure, yet when force was required, he was by no means hesitant. When rebellion flared in northern Gaul, he dispatched his legions with decisive speed and crushed it. In short, this was not a man given to reckless warmongering, and yet it was during his reign that Rome suffered one of the most catastrophic military defeats in its long and storied history. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Ever since Caesar's conquest of Gaul, Rome had come face to face with the Germanic tribes to the north, to better manage the small portion of Germania they had subdued. The Romans established a new province, garrisoning it with a substantial military force. The trouble began when Rome attempted to introduce its systems of law and, more pointedly, taxation. When they tried to collect taxes from the Germanic tribesmen, men who for the most part could not read a single letter, the brothers-in-arms were having none of it. They rose up as one, declaring, "Taxes, what is this strange new device? We have never heard of it. Our lives you may take, but nothing else." And so, in the year 9 AD, a great Germanic uprising erupted. The local Roman governor, a man named Varus, led 3 Roman legions to quell it. He was utterly defeated. The humiliation was compounded by the nature of the defeat. This was not a loss on an open field of battle, a fair contest of arms. Varus and his men were tricked, lured into a treacherous ambush in the dense forest, and annihilated. Of the more than 20,000 Roman soldiers, almost none survived. It was a disaster that ranks in the top 3 of Rome's worst military failures. To be beaten by barbarians was one thing, but to be outthought, outmaneuvered by those whom Rome considered little more than uncouth rustics, well, that was an insult of a different order. Varus, it seems, felt he could not live with the shame. He took his own life on the battlefield. The news, when it reached Rome, sent the aging Octavian into a famous rage, crying out for his lost legions. But anger is fleeting. Upon reflection, he concluded that to launch another ruinously expensive campaign for those desolate lands was simply not worth the cost. After a few more skirmishes and some calculated concessions, the border between Roman and Germanic territories gradually stabilized along the Rhine and Danube rivers. Octavian did not, for the sake of his pride, pursue an endless, fruitless war. For this, he deserves no small amount of credit. As an aside, the Germanic commander who orchestrated this stunning victory was named Arminius. For a very long time, he was regarded as a hero, hailed by the historian Tacitus as the liberator of Germania. During the unification of Germany in the 19th century, he was celebrated as a symbol of Teutonic freedom. Today, in the 21st century, as nationalism is no longer considered a particularly fashionable sentiment in Germany. His star has faded. Many Germans today are entirely unaware that they ever had such a formidable ancestor. But to return to our main subject, if his foreign policy was not one of expansion, his domestic policy was one of restoration and recreation. If it could be summarized in a single word, that word would be engagement. He encouraged all manner of public entertainments and festivals. He launched a massive building program in Rome, constructing numerous venues for public amusement. He even established the world's first state-owned, professional fire brigade. A sensible precaution, one imagines, when you encourage your entire populace to enjoy themselves late into the night, lest they accidentally set their homes ablaze. He was often heard to boast, and with justification, that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, a veritable titan of infrastructure. The reign of Augustus was also the golden age of Roman literature and art. He was a great patron to poets, artists, writers, and architects. Among the most famous was Livy, whose monumental history of Rome remains a foundational text for the study of the Roman Republic. Livy was also a master of the Latin language, standing alongside Cicero and, slightly later, Tacitus, as one of the three great titans of Latin prose. Through these policies, both foreign and domestic, Octavian earned the genuine adoration of everyone from his former enemies to the common Roman citizen to the intellectual elite. So much so that later historians, even the most cynical, are forced to concede that these 40 years were a true golden age for Rome. To what degree did this heartfelt affection extend? It can be said that by the time of Octavian's death, there was scarcely a person left in Rome who wished to return to the pure, chaotic republic of old. The people had concluded that having one supreme ruler, a man of absolute authority, was far superior to being governed by a herd of squabbling senators who never seemed to get anything done. Based on this new consensus, the Roman elite granted Octavian a privilege previously unthinkable, the right to name his own successor, and this successor would inherit not just Octavian's property and name, as Caesar's had, but his power. In the old republic, this would have been anathema, but now, not only was the system a de facto monarchy, but the Roman people, from top to bottom, including the Senate itself, had psychologically surrendered to this new model, an autocracy wearing a republican mask. No one was willing, and perhaps no one dared, to say no to this new system. So, was it easy for Octavian to choose an heir? In truth, it was painfully difficult. The difficulty was twofold. First, he had no sons, only a single daughter, the infamous Julia. This meant the pool of candidates was wide and rather messy. Subordinates, relatives, stepsons, all were possibilities. The second difficulty was that Octavian, though frail and sickly from a young age, lived an unusually long life. He survived to the age of 77. Such longevity meant that many of the heirs he had carefully selected and groomed died before he did. His nephew and first son-in-law, Marcellus, his most loyal subordinate and second son-in-law, Agrippa, his own grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, all were cultivated as his successors. Alas, the old man simply refused to die, and so, one by one, they preceded him to the grave. The final, lucky candidate, the last man standing, was named Tiberius Claudius Nero. We know him simply as Tiberius. He was Octavian's stepson, the child of his wife Livia from her previous marriage. He was also to complete the tangled web, Octavian's third son-in-law. When Agrippa died in 13 BC, Tiberius was compelled to divorce his own wife and marry Octavian's widowed daughter. Julia, if you are tempted to sneer at this as an act of naked ambition, you would misunderstand the man. This was not his desire. It was Octavian who, unwilling to see his precious daughter remain a widow, forced the marriage upon Tiberius. It was, to put it mildly, a union forged by decree, not affection. And their relationship was famously fraught. Tiberius eventually went into self-imposed exile on the island of Rhodes, citing ill health as his excuse. But then, through a series of tragic turns, every other plausible heir died. Octavian, left with no alternative, was forced to recall his reluctant son-in-law to Rome to prepare him for the succession. On the 19th of August, in the year 14 AD, Augustus Octavian died. It is said that his last words to those gathered at his bedside were, "Have I played the part well? Then applaud as I exit." And had he, the performance was, without question, sublime. From a bewildered teenager thrust onto the political stage, he grew into the master of Rome. He possessed neither a strong physique nor any particular military genius. The great figures we have discussed before, Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, were men of fire and action. With Octavian, something altogether new arrives on the stage of power. He was not the glorious warrior, but the grandmaster of the long game, the architect. Not the conqueror. In that age of warring strongmen, to have merely survived would have been a miracle, yet he did not just survive, he reached the summit. And not only did he reach the summit, he fundamentally remade the Roman state and ushered in centuries of prosperity. His success, as I see it, rested upon four pillars: a supreme talent for politics, a supreme capacity for learning, a supreme eye for talent, and finally, a supreme, almost inhuman, patience. But we must understand that his final words held a deeper philosophical resonance. The Greek philosopher Plato, whom we have met before, once famously said that life is but a rehearsal for death. This was, in essence, the worldview of the pre-Christian Greco-Roman elite. Life is a play. It is all a performance, a preparation for the final curtain, for Octavian to say, at the very end, that he had played his part well, was his final, satisfying philosophical summary of his own existence. In a word, even at the moment of his death, the man was still performing, still flaunting his intellectual depth. The true greatness of Octavian lies in this: he inaugurated a period of peace that would last for 200 years. The Pax Romana, from his accession as Augustus in 27 BC to the death of the last of the five good emperors in 180 AD, Rome experienced a period of remarkable stability and prosperity. Though the system had shifted from a republic to a de facto monarchy, and though the emperors and the aristocracy would grow ever more decadent, it is also a fact that the lives of ordinary people steadily improved. To return to the narrative, after Octavian's death, his third son-in-law and stepson, Tiberius, with the unanimous consent of the Senate, legally inherited all of Augustus's powers. He became the second emperor of Rome, and how did this second emperor fare? Was his performance as brilliant as that of Augustus? Tiberius, the second emperor of Rome, was a man of a rather different sort. He was old-fashioned, austere, and deeply conservative. Upon taking power, he immediately began to promote simplicity and frugality. He slashed spending on public entertainment and games, restricted the consumption of luxury goods, and led by example in encouraging thrift. This, it must be said, made the Roman people exceptionally unhappy. The Roman citizen had three great loves: gladiatorial combat, war, and public baths. Austerity had never been a celebrated Roman virtue. To suddenly find that, under this new emperor, even getting a good soak at the bathhouse was becoming a complicated affair, well, it did not endear him to the masses. But these were minor grievances. The true stain on Tiberius's reputation stems from what followed. Octavian had a granddaughter, Agrippina the Elder. As the person with the closest blood link to the deified Augustus, she was beloved by the Roman people. She was married to a man named Germanicus, and he was no stranger. He was Tiberius's own nephew. You must note, Germanicus was not his real name. It was a title, an honorific, meaning conqueror of the Germans. One glance tells you this was a Roman hero, a man capable of defeating the barbarians. So here we had a man who was a military hero, the husband of Augustus's granddaughter, and the nephew of the current emperor. Germanicus was, by any measure, the perfect candidate to be the next emperor of Rome. Initially, Tiberius seemed to agree, constantly promoting his nephew. But then, while Germanicus was on a tour of duty in the eastern provinces, a curious thing happened. He was poisoned. He died. The accused killer committed suicide before he could be brought to trial. Yet Tiberius, in a move that baffled many, moved to protect the dead man's reputation and his family. At this, public opinion erupted. The people concluded that the black hand behind the death of the beloved Germanicus was none other than Tiberius himself. The old man, they whispered, wanted his own son to inherit the throne. Before this storm had even passed, in the year 30 AD, Tiberius, on the pretext of a conspiracy, had Agrippina the Elder exiled. Her fate was even more tragic. Unwilling to suffer the humiliation, she starved herself to death. Of her 3 sons, all but the youngest, Caligula, would also die. One of them, it is said, was deliberately starved to death. This sequence of events has forever painted Tiberius, in the works of nearly all Roman historians, as a cruel and ruthless tyrant, a man who would stop at nothing for power. Suetonius, in his The 12 Caesars, went so far as to attribute every salacious rumor and piece of gossip he could find to Tiberius. When, in his 70s, Tiberius retired to the island of Capri to govern the empire by proxy, Suetonius portrayed it as a retreat for debauchery, where the elderly emperor frolicked with a harem of foreign beauties. Later scholarship, it should be said, has cast serious doubt on these tales, suggesting they were likely a coordinated political smear. It was not until the 19th century that historians began to rehabilitate Tiberius, arguing that he may have been a competent, if unpopular, emperor under whom the Roman people were actually quite prosperous. Alas, these kinda reviews came far too late for Tiberius to hear them. In the year 37 AD, at the advanced age of 79, he died on his island retreat. His will stipulated that his power should be shared jointly between his grandson, also named Tiberius, and Caligula. From this, we can see that Tiberius certainly had a preference for his own bloodline, had his own son not died before him. The throne would surely have passed to him, but he also knew that with his son gone, his grandson was too young and too vulnerable. He knew that the hearts of the Roman people belonged to Caligula, the last surviving son of the martyred Germanicus and Agrippina. Under such circumstances, if he insisted on leaving the throne solely to his grandson, the boy would likely not survive the night, and so he devised this compromise, a joint rule, a hope, perhaps, that his grandson might one day grow strong enough to claim the throne for himself. It was, of course, a fantasy, a plan built on water. The Roman Senate simply ignored his grandson entirely and bestowed all imperial powers and titles upon the great-grandson of Augustus. Upon Caligula, according to the official histories, this new emperor's full name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, a cascade of inherited glory. You will notice, however, that the name Caligula is not among them. Why then do we call him that? Caligula was, in fact, the emperor's childhood nickname. It means little boot, a name given to him by the soldiers when, as a boy, he would accompany his father Germanicus on military campaigns, dressed in a miniature soldier's uniform, complete with tiny military boots, to refer to an emperor not by his name, nor by his honorifics, but by a diminutive and slightly comical nickname. Well, it suggests one thing. history has judged that little Boot went rather off the rails, that he was not, shall we say, a success in the profession of emperor. In fairness, Caligula's reign began magnificently. He showed much of the flair of his great-grandfather Augustus. He invested in public works, hosted popular events to build civic unity, and enacted policies that brought real benefits to the people. More importantly, he displayed a remarkable magnanimity. He formally adopted the young Tiberius, the boy who was meant to be his co-ruler, as his own son. The message was clear: the Senate may have ignored your grandfather's will, but I will honor it. After me, the throne is yours. With this single act, any lingering resentment from the faction of Tiberius vanished. The Roman people breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had another good emperor. Alas, this happy state of affairs lasted only a few months. In October of that same year, 37 AD, Caligula fell gravely ill. He very nearly went to meet Augustus in the afterlife. When he recovered, the man had changed. The change was total, but it can be summarized in 2 words: cruelty and absurdity. First, he dispatched his adopted son, the young Tiberius, to the next world with a cup of poisoned wine. Then he declared open war on the Senate. Beyond simply torturing and executing aristocrats for sport, he developed a peculiar habit of summoning the wives of senators and noblemen to his palace, violating them and then returning them to their husbands. His spending was like water flowing through a sieve. The vast treasury that Augustus and Tiberius had so painstakingly accumulated, he exhausted in a single year, and when the money was gone, he turned to the people. He invented a dizzying array of new taxes. For example, a new law decreed that if you died without leaving a portion of your estate to the emperor, to the great Caligula, your will was legally void. His governance descended into a kind of surrealist theater. He famously declared his favorite horse Incitatus, a consul of Rome. You might ask, did the Senate and the people of Rome not resist? Where was the spirit that had struck down Caesar with a flurry of daggers? The problem was, striking down Caligula with a flurry of daggers was now nearly impossible, and for that, they had Augustus and Tiberius to thank. Those 2 men had long ago understood that in shifting from a republic to an autocracy, the greatest threat was a senatorial revolt. So, one created the Praetorian Guard, and the other strengthened it. By the time Caligula took the throne, the guard protecting the emperor in Rome numbered in the tens of thousands, and they were the elite of the army. How many senators were now willing to risk their lives against such a force? But think for a moment. If the Praetorian Guard made the emperor safe from the Senate, what if the Guard itself were to revolt? The problem remains: an emperor, therefore, must choose the leaders of his Guard with care and keep them loyal. But the mind of our little Boot, Caligula, must surely have been damaged in his illness, because he began, actively, to humiliate the commander of his own Guard. The commander's name was Cassius Chaerea. As a young man, he had suffered a wound to his groin in battle. It was a source of private pain, yet Caligula took to mocking him in public, calling him Priapus. Who was Priapus? He was the Greek god of fertility. Cursed in his mother's womb by the goddess Hera, he was said to possess a monstrously large and permanently erect member that he could never retract. To this day, the medical term for a persistent, painful erection is priapism. As an aside, in a curious reversal of modern sensibilities, the ancient Greeks considered a smaller male endowment to be a sign of high character. To them, a large member signified a man ruled by lust, a fool enslaved by his base desires. A smaller one, by contrast, suggested a rational, calm, and intellectually mature man. The playwright Aristophanes, in his comedy The Clouds, lays out the ideal of male beauty: a smooth chest, fair skin, broad shoulders, a nimble tongue, a firm backside, and a small phallus. This aesthetic was inherited by the Roman elite and later revived during the Renaissance. It is why, when you view the great sculptures and paintings of Western art, the heroic male figures are modest in their proportions, while villains and satyrs are often depicted quite differently. To return to our story, for Caligula to taunt Chaerea by comparing him to the god Priapus was the ultimate insult. It was, as they say, twisting the knife. On the 24th of January, in the year 41 AD, as Caligula was heading to lunch, a most mundane activity, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, Cassius Chaerea, approached him. His patience exhausted and his fury overflowing, he, with a single swift stroke of his sword, killed him, the great emperor of Rome. A mere 29 years old, was dead. The captain, Chaerea, was in some ways more cunning than Brutus had been. After dispatching Caligula, he and his fellow officers found a 50-year-old man hiding behind a curtain, and declared that they, the Praetorian Guard, would unanimously support him as the fourth emperor of Rome. This man's name was Claudius. He was the nephew of the second emperor, Tiberius, and the grandson of Octavia, the sister of Augustus. This meant that Mark Antony was his grandfather. You need not untangle the web of relations. You need only know one thing. He too had a blood connection to the divine Augustus, and in this era, that was the ultimate credential. This raises a question. Why, when we spoke of Augustus's search for an heir, was his name never mentioned? The reason is not complicated. The man was disabled. The exact nature of his condition is unknown. But his physical appearance was considered grotesque. His own mother, the niece of Augustus, was said to have described her son as a monster whom nature had begun but not finished. And so, he had never been seriously considered as a successor. This was the man whom the Praetorian Guard now tapped to rule the world, while the Guard was persuading Claudius of his destiny. The Roman Senate was in frantic session, debating another matter entirely. The emperor was suddenly dead. Was this their chance? A golden opportunity to restore the Republic? Of course it was, but there was a problem. The Praetorian Guard would never agree. A restoration of the Republic would mean the end of their privileges. Indeed, the end of their very existence. In the end, after much deliberation, the senators lost their nerve. They publicly announced their support for the Guard's decision and acclaimed Claudius as the new emperor of Rome. They would continue down the bright and shining path of the Principate. You have likely noticed a pattern emerging. The Praetorian Guard had now become a force capable of making and unmaking emperors, a force that could dictate the course of Roman politics. This sowed the seeds of many future crises. Claudius may have been physically disabled, but his mind was exceptionally sharp. He understood his position perfectly. He was a puppet of the Guard. With no power base of his own, the best way to counterbalance their influence was to cooperate with the Senate. And so, he relinquished many of the emperor's special privileges in a bid to win the Senate's full support. At the same time, Claudius knew he needed military glory to solidify his rule. From its very first day, Rome was a beast fueled by outward expansion. For a Roman leader, the surest path to popular support was military victory. In the year 43 AD, Claudius, in his quest for military prestige, launched the conquest of Britain. We have mentioned that Caesar twice invaded the island, and though the Celtic tribes there had capitulated, the moment Caesar's legions withdrew, Britannia returned to its previous state of fractious independence. The actual military effect of Claudius's invasion is not entirely clear from the historical record, but that did not stop Claudius from returning from the island and engaging in a masterful campaign of public relations. He constructed the famous Arch of Claudius, a precursor to the modern Triumphal Arch. Though it no longer stands, surviving fragments bear an inscription. It reads that Claudius brought barbarian peoples beyond the ocean into the dominion of the Roman people. Judging from later events, the old man was likely exaggerating. At most, he had conquered the southern parts of what is now England. My evidence for this is simple. Rome had to launch many subsequent campaigns. It was not until the year 61 AD that Rome could officially declare Britain subdued and establish it as a formal province. At the same time, they built a military fort on the banks of the River Thames. It would later grow into Britain's greatest city, London, but a little boastfulness is hardly a major flaw. For the sake of political power, it is quite normal. Yet, no matter how much Claudius boasted of his heroic deeds, he could not change one simple fact. He could not control his wife. Her name was Messalina. She was Claudius's third wife and nearly 30 years his junior. Claudius was already old, and the duties of being emperor left him little time or energy for his young bride. So Messalina, it seems, decided to find her own amusements. Throughout history, unfaithful empresses have not been uncommon. Some, the bolder ones, might keep a few handsome young lovers. It is hardly scandalous, but in terms of sheer, audacious promiscuity, if Messalina were to declare herself second, no one in world history would dare claim to be first. According to the influential accounts of Tacitus and Suetonius, Messalina slept with a vast and varied assortment of handsome men, becoming the talk of all Rome. One Roman consul, a man named Vinicius, was said to have been murdered by her agents for refusing her advances, but this was just the beginning. After a time, the thrill of seducing one or two men at a time apparently wore off, so she began frequenting a brothel in Rome, not for money, but simply for the pleasure of it. The writer Pliny the Elder, in his famous work Natural History, even recounts a contest between Messalina and a professional prostitute, the Empress of Rome. He claims, won the contest, with a final score of 25 men in a single day and night. While these stories come from so-called authoritative sources written by famous men, some later historians have suggested they might be a collective political smear. The truth is now impossible to discern, but true or not, on the pillar of historical judgment. The pen is mightier than the sword. Messalina's reputation as the imperial prostitute was cemented, echoing through European history. Countless works of art depict her, almost all of them in a lurid, erotic style, focused on her life in the brothel. One might think that with a husband who did not care, and a court that did not dare to intervene, Messalina would be satisfied. But for reasons that defy comprehension, one day, while her husband Claudius, the emperor of Rome, was away from the city, she held a wedding ceremony with a new lover, a man named Silius. Now this was a problem. Your dalliances, your search for pleasure, I might overlook. But to marry another man, what is the meaning of this? Do you seek to replace me? That I cannot allow. The imperial power does not tolerate rivals. And so, Claudius rushed back to the city. With lightning speed, he arrested his wife, her handsome new husband Silius, and all who had attended the wedding. They were all executed. The entire affair was treated as a political coup. With his wife dead, Claudius immediately began searching for a new one. This was not for his own personal needs, but for the needs of the empire. He required an empress. After some searching, he found a candidate, his own niece, Agrippina the Younger, if that name sounds familiar. It should. She was the daughter of the very same Agrippina the Elder we spoke of earlier. She was also the great-granddaughter of Augustus himself. So now, the grandson of Augustus's sister was legally married to Augustus's own great-granddaughter. If you find this relationship bewilderingly tangled, you do not understand Rome or ancient Europe. In truth, as long as it was not a union of direct father and daughter or mother and son, the Romans considered marriage to a niece or a nephew to be perfectly commonplace. As the old saying goes, keep it in the family. This practice would, in fact, become a tradition among European royalty for over 1,000 years, even when the Catholic Church later forbade marriage between close relatives. It often made special exceptions for royalty in their quest for pure bloodlines, but that is a story for another time. So, with a new wife, did Claudius finally find domestic bliss? The answer is no. Not only did he not find happiness, he ended up losing his life at the hands of his new bride, the Roman Emperor Claudius, having executed one wife, now took a new one. At first he must have been quite content. The new empress, Agrippina the Younger, was not like her reckless predecessor. She flattered Claudius, pandered to his every whim, and the old emperor felt that this second spring of his life was rather pleasant, but his new wife had a purpose, an ambition. She had a treasured son from a previous marriage, a boy named Lucius. Today, however, we do not call him by that name. We know him by the name he would later adopt. Nero. Through a constant campaign of persuasion and sweet whispers, Agrippina finally convinced Claudius of a most peculiar logic, that adopting Nero as his own son and making him his heir would be of great benefit to Claudius's own biological son. Frankly, if my own mind has not been damaged, this is a line of reasoning that I cannot follow. Yet Agrippina somehow made a not unintelligent Roman emperor believe it and accept it. The power of this woman, her ambition, her skill, her influence in the imperial bedchamber, was truly formidable. Once this decision was made, the will formally drawn up and publicly announced, Claudius had outlived his usefulness. Not long after, on the 13th of October in the year 54 AD, after eating a plate of mushrooms served to him by his wife, he kicked his legs one last time and went to join Augustus. He was 64 years old. Although there is no definitive proof, nearly all historians, including Tacitus, are unanimous in their verdict. It was Agrippina who administered the poison. They differ only on the minor details of how it was done. Upon Claudius's death, a 17-year-old Nero stepped onto the stage of history, regardless of how we judge Nero today. We must be honest and say that in his early years, he was a rather good emperor. His reign was characterized by popular appeal and sound governance. He would often train alongside his soldiers. When the state launched a major waterworks project, he was the first to pick up a shovel and walk onto the dam. He enacted many policies that benefited the common people. There are two which, when I first read of them, filled me with a sense of wonder. One was his abolition of the fee for attending court proceedings, as long as a case did not involve state secrets. Any citizen who wished to could sit and observe the judges at work. This undoubtedly made the judiciary more transparent and forced judges to be more cautious in their rulings. The other was even more remarkable. Nero placed limits on legal fees. He decreed that for certain cases involving the lower classes, the fees a lawyer could charge had a strict upper limit. Even if a client tried to stuff more money into your pockets, you were legally obligated to refuse it. Why is this so remarkable? Because if legal fees are uncapped, the best lawyers will naturally gravitate to the wealthy. The poor have no hope of hiring effective counsel and are thus far more likely to lose their cases. While this single policy could not solve all the ills of the legal system, it at least gave the poor a glimmer of hope. In this respect, it was more progressive than the systems of most nations today. But while Nero was a fine emperor, behind him loomed a great shadow, or perhaps a small white hand, his mother's hand. It was she who had placed him on the throne. And the problem was, after Nero's accession, that hand showed no desire to withdraw. In other words, Agrippina attempted to rule through her son. When Nero realized this, he began to push back. In the second year of his reign, he, as emperor, forbade his mother from attending a diplomatic banquet. Agrippina was furious. "You little whelp," she must have thought, "you dare defy me." She summoned Nero and gave him a furious dressing down. She reminded him that his unfortunate stepfather, Claudius, had a biological son of his own. "If you continue to treat me this way," she threatened, "I will have you removed and put that boy on the throne." We do not know what Nero said to her face, but not long after, his unfortunate stepbrother, who was his brother by neither blood nor marriage, was poisoned in full view of everyone at a banquet. As the boy writhed on the floor, Nero continued to eat his meal, pointing at him and announcing, "Don't help him. It's just an epileptic fit. He'll be fine in a moment." And indeed, if fine is defined as no longer writhing in agony, then his brother was fine very quickly. He never moved again. the death of this boy was the opening salvo in the war between mother and son. The struggle, both open and covert, continued until March 23rd. In the year 59 AD, Nero finally made his move, on the pretext that his mother was plotting against him. He sent soldiers to have her killed. With that, Nero began his period of absolute rule. The popular view today is that this absolute power untethered him. That, like the third emperor, Caligula, he performed a 180-degree turn. He transformed from a capable and effective ruler into a cruel and somewhat nonsensical tyrant. Is this view correct? Let us not rush to a conclusion. First, let us look at a great fire. On July 17th, in the year 64 AD, a fire broke out in the Circus Maximus in Rome. The arena was filled with flammable materials like tents and wooden structures. The fire spread rapidly, raging for 6 days and 7 nights. The city of Rome was burned to a horrifying extent. Of its 14 administrative districts, 3 were completely destroyed and 7 were reduced to smoldering ruins. Only 4 districts were untouched. How this mysterious fire started remains a mystery to this day. At the time, the people of Rome and Nero himself were equally bewildered and aghast. But as the supreme leader, if he could not find a culprit to appease the public's anger, that anger might very well turn upon him in this situation. Nero found a scapegoat, or rather a group of them, a small, obscure sect known as the Christians. To explain who these people were, we must rewind our story back to the Jews and to King Herod. According to the sacred text of Christianity, the New Testament, in the very first year of our common era, in the city of Nazareth, in the Roman province of Judea, a young woman named Mary was betrothed to a carpenter named Joseph. But before their wedding night, an angel appeared and informed Mary that she would conceive a child without knowing a man. For she had found favor with God, and so it came to pass. Mary's belly grew, and she was with child. This is known as the Immaculate Conception. You need not ask me if such a miraculous event is true. I do not know. Her fiancé, Joseph, upon hearing this news, reacted much as I would, with profound confusion. He planned to break off the engagement. This was a 2-for-1 deal he had no interest in. But just as he had this thought, an angel appeared before him and sternly informed him, "This child is of God. Not only must you not break the engagement, you must joyfully accept the role of his father." At that time, the Romans were conducting a census, which required all residents to return to their ancestral homes. Joseph, being from the city of Bethlehem, had no choice but to take the heavily pregnant Mary on the journey. It was there, in the stable of an inn, that Mary gave birth to an extraordinary child. As instructed by the angel, they named him Jesus. Today he is known as Jesus of Nazareth, as his mother was a resident of that city. Upon his birth, angels appeared to shepherds in the fields, announcing that their Lord, the Christ, had been born, and that he would be the King of all Jews. The angel, to ensure the shepherds understood, chose to speak in Greek. The word Christos is the Greek for anointed one. As we have mentioned, in Hebrew, this same concept is rendered as Messiah, the Savior from the Jewish Holy Scriptures. The original meaning is simply one whose head has been anointed with precious oil. Historians have studied this and found that ancient Jewish kings and high priests underwent such a ceremony upon taking office. The most likely reason is that the Arabian Peninsula was simply so arid that to be able to apply some form of moisturizing cream every day was a mark of supreme luxury. And so a tradition developed to anoint the heads of the great and powerful, anointed one, Messiah, Christ. They all mean the same thing. To return to the story, the angels made their announcement, and the shepherds spread the news. Soon, it reached the ears of King Herod the Great. What? A Jewish boy has been born who will be king of all the Jews. Then what is to become of me, and my sons, and my grandsons? And so, he gave a terrible order to slaughter every male infant 2 years of age and under in and around the city of Bethlehem. But this old king did not stop to think. A child sent by heaven could hardly be killed by a petty ruler like him. He had already been taken by his earthly father, Joseph, to safety in Egypt. Only after Herod's death did they return to Nazareth. According to the New Testament, when Jesus was 30 years old, he was baptized in the river Jordan by a man named John. He then fasted for 40 days. From that point on, he began his ministry, gathering 12 disciples, because he was called the Christ, the Anointed One. His following became known as Christianity. The baptism by John is now one of the most important Christian rituals. The word baptism itself comes from a Greek word meaning simply to wash something that is dirty. It has since become a most sacred act. The teachings of Jesus were in essence quite similar to Judaism. There is only one God. You must love God, love others. Even love your enemies. You must not be greedy or lustful. For those interested, one can watch religious films or perhaps films with religious themes. But as the saying goes, there is no hatred so pure as that between competitors in the same trade. In the course of his ministry, Jesus came into severe conflict with the established Jewish religious authorities. The main points of contention were two. First, he not only went about proclaiming himself to be the Christ, the Messiah, but also the Son of God. This deeply offended traditional Jewish believers. The second problem was the breadth of his ministry. He not only helped those considered sinners by the Jewish establishment, prostitutes, tax collectors, and the like, but he also preached to non-Jews. This fundamentally violated a core tenet of the Old Testament, which held that God's covenant was exclusively with the Jewish people. God would save only the Jews, but now Jesus was saying that God's mercy was so vast that he would save anyone. All you had to do was believe, if after doing these things. Jesus had humbly accepted the criticism of the Jewish elders. Perhaps nothing major would have come of it, but he did not. He not only defied them, but he publicly denounced their hypocrisy, their greed, and their various failings. This caused the respected elders to lose face entirely, and they were filled with rage around the year 30 AD. Jesus, now about 33 years old, entered Jerusalem for the last time. After sharing a final meal with his 12 disciples, he was betrayed by one of them, Judas, and arrested by the Jewish authorities. The charge against him was blasphemy for calling himself the Christ, the Son of God. However, they did not have the authority to carry out an execution. Judea was a Roman province, under the jurisdiction of the governor, Pontius Pilate, and Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. Neither of these men initially had any desire to kill Jesus. They hardly cared who or what a Christ was, but the Jewish high priests and a large, agitated crowd outside demanded the death penalty. Pilate even offered them a choice. Release this Jesus, or release a notorious bandit. The crowd, as one, shouted for the release of the bandit. The governor must have wondered, how many people has this Jesus offended? In the face of such public fury, if I do not sentence him to death, these people might riot, and if they riot, the great Emperor Tiberius will surely sentence me to death. And so, Jesus was sentenced first to be flogged, then forced to carry his own cross to the place of execution, where he was nailed to it. After about 3 hours, he breathed his last. A Roman soldier standing by, a man named Longinus, to verify that Jesus was dead, pierced his side with a spear. That spear would become the legendary Holy Lance, also known as the Spear of Destiny or the Lance of Longinus. This spear, along with the cross upon which he died, are now among the most precious relics of Christianity. There are, however, many versions of them in existence. As to which is the true one, I truly do not know. It is worth noting here that crucifixion as a method of execution has nothing to do with Christianity or Judaism. It was a common practice in Babylon, Persia, and Rome. The condemned would typically carry their own cross through the streets before being nailed to it, where they would slowly suffocate to death. It was an exceptionally cruel method. In those times, no one would have considered displaying such an object in their home. It would have been horrifying, but since the death of Jesus and the rise of Christianity, the cross has become a sacred symbol seen everywhere to this day. The day Jesus died was a Friday, now known as Good Friday. One might ask, why Good Friday and not Bad Friday? This is due to a shift in the meaning of the English word. In Old English, good often simply meant holy. It does not mean that people were celebrating his death. Good Friday is generally a holiday in the West. The Monday following that weekend is the celebrated festival of Easter. The Bible says that on the third day after his death, Jesus was resurrected. A festival was therefore required to celebrate this. After his resurrection, he appeared to his disciples, encouraging them and strengthening their faith. He lingered on earth for some 40 days before finally ascending to heaven, leaving them with a final promise, "I will return." When will he return? The Bible says it will be at the last judgment. On that day, all the dead will be resurrected to be judged by Jesus. Some will go to heaven, others to hell. As to which is preferable, you may ponder that in your own time. Like Buddhism, through the tireless efforts of countless followers after his death, Christianity grew in size and influence. The central doctrine became that Jesus, with his own blood, had washed away the original sin of humanity. The barrier between God and man was gone. The path to heaven was now more accessible. One only had to believe in him and in this act, and all would be well. A key figure in the promotion of this theology was a man named Paul. He was originally an opponent of Christianity, but after Jesus' death, a vision of the risen Christ appeared to him, and he became a devout missionary. He traveled throughout Asia Minor, Greece, and Italy, establishing many non-Jewish Christian communities. And most importantly, more than half of the New Testament is attributed to his writings. In the eyes of Christians, the key difference between the Old and New Testaments is this: the Old Testament promises salvation only for the Jews. The New Testament, sealed by the blood of Jesus, is based primarily on the principle of faith. What you do is secondary. What matters most is that you believe. Only through belief can you be saved. It is probably best, however, not to discuss the merits of the New Testament with a devout Jew. They have never accepted that Jesus is the Son of God. To them, the New Testament is an insult. It suggests that their ancient covenant with God is obsolete. There is another small piece of common knowledge to impart here. The system by which we number our years, for instance, the year 2024 AD, means the 2024th year after the birth of Jesus. The abbreviation AD comes from the Latin Anno Domini, meaning in the year of our Lord. The abbreviation BC, for years before that, comes from the English before Christ. This entire system was invented in the 5th century AD, some 500 years after Jesus' death, and is still in use today. This, then, is the general origin and development of Christianity. In truth, almost all of this account comes from the New Testament. In the historical records and state archives of the time, there is virtually no mention of Jesus or his deeds. For example, the Bible says his death was a major event, involving the provincial governor Pilate and the Jewish ruler Herod. Yet historians have scoured the records of the time and found not a single word about the case. Another example, the Bible says that at the time of Jesus' birth in year 1, King Herod was slaughtering infants to find him. Yet historical records state quite clearly that Herod the Great died in the year 4 BC. How could he have been chasing a child born 4 years after his own death? Of course, some now explain this by saying that we simply miscalculated Jesus' birth year. We do not know the truth of this. Not only that, but many traditions that are not even in the Bible have developed over the centuries. Christmas, for example. On December 25th, the entire world now knows this as the day Jesus was born in a manger, but this date is nowhere to be found in the Bible. It was nearly 400 years after his death that the Roman Catholic Church co-opted the festival of Sol Invictus, the pagan sun god, and declared it to be Jesus' birthday. The reason was that the later Roman emperor, Constantine the Great, believed that Jesus was the sun, the light, the warmth, the source of all things, and so, for centuries, skeptical philosophers and historians have asked a pointed question: did Jesus create Christianity? Or did Christianity create Jesus? Did this man ever truly exist? But if you argue that Jesus was a purely fictional character, you run into another logical problem. During the early Roman Empire, when Christianity was fiercely persecuted, why is it that in all the voluminous attacks written against the new faith, we never find a single one that questions the existence of Jesus himself? This strongly suggests that the people of that time, both friend and foe, widely accepted that Jesus was a real person who had actually lived. If you ask me for the answer to these debates, I can only reply honestly, I do not know. We must, however, return to our main subject, to the great Emperor Nero. We return to the ashes of Rome and ask, why, when his city suffered such a catastrophic fire, did this emperor choose to cast the blame upon the Christians?